Tonight's stories have a unique twist. They all come from viewers who are avid true crime podcast listeners, just like many of you watching this video. These 4 people thought they knew everything about staying safe because they've heard hundreds of horror stories through their headphones. But as you'll learn tonight, sometimes knowing about danger doesn't protect you from it. In fact, sometimes it makes you more of a target. The first story comes from Rachel, a 24-year-old graphic designer from Wisconsin. I've been obsessed with true crime since I was in high school. My friends thought it was weird, but I find it fascinating to understand the psychology behind the cases. I listen to podcasts during my commute, while I work, while I clean, basically whenever I can. My favourite show is called Dark Waters, that covers lesser known cases from the Midwest. About 6 months ago, I started getting emails from someone claiming they have information about an unsolved case that had been featured on Dark Waters. The case was about a woman named Linda Morrison who disappeared from a small town in Minnesota in 1987. Her body was never found, and the case went cold. The first email seemed legitimate. The sender, who went by Truth Seeker 87, said they'd grown up in the same town and remembered details that weren't covered in the podcast. They shared specific information about Linda's daily routine and mentioned a local man who had always seemed suspicious but was actually never investigated. I was intrigued, so I responded. True crime fans love getting new information about cases, especially cold cases. Truth Seeker 87 seemed knowledgeable and passionate about finding justice for Linda. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged dozens of emails. They would send me newspaper clippings, old photos, and what appeared to be police reports. Everything seemed genuine, and I started to think this person might have valuable information that could help potentially solve the case. But then the emails started to get personal. Truth Seeker 87 began asking about my life, where I lived, what I did for work, if I lived alone. But when I asked why they needed to know these things, they said they wanted to make sure I was trustworthy before sharing more sensitive information. Red flags should have been going off, but I was so caught up in the mystery of it all that I answered their questions. I told them I lived alone in an apartment in Milwaukee, that I worked from home, and that I was single. A week later, I received a chilling email. It contained photos of my apartment building and photos of my car in the parking lot, and even me walking to my mailbox. The subject line said, "Just making sure you are who you say you are." I immediately stopped responding to the emails, but they kept coming. Truth Seeker 87 got increasingly aggressive, accusing me of abandoning Linda and not caring about justice. These emails started arriving at all hours of the day and night. One morning, I woke up to find an envelope slipped under my apartment door. Inside of it was a printout of our entire email conversation, with notes written in red ink throughout the margins. Next to my responses, someone had written things like "liar" and "she knows more than she's saying." But the most disturbing part was what was written at the bottom of the last page. Rachel Morrison, another Linda. They had connected my first name to Linda Morrison's last name, as if I was somehow related to the case. But I'm not. I'd never heard of Linda before the podcast episode. I called the police but they said no direct threats had been made, so there really wasn't much they could do. They advised me to document everything and contact them if the situation continued to escalate. And of course, it did. 3 days later, I came home from running errands to find my apartment door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but someone had definitely been inside. All my true crime books had been pulled from their shelves and arranged on my coffee table. On the top of the stack was a handwritten note. Still learning about killers, Rachel? Maybe it's time you learned about being a victim. I packed a bag and went to stay with my sister's family immediately. From her house, I called the police again. This time, they took it seriously. Officers went to check in my apartment. They didn't find much of interest, but down the corridor, they found that someone had been living in one of the storage rooms. They found an old sleeping bag and a laptop with folders full of information about true crime podcast fans. This person had been targeting multiple people across different states, all women who had listened to the same podcast I did. The police think that Truth Seeker 87 would find active true crime communities, identify female fans who seemed isolated or alone, then create elaborate stories about unsolved cases. They build trust and gather personal information. They never caught him. The email account was traced to a public library computer, and the storage room had been wiped of fingerprints. It does make me think though, while he would leave his laptop, or maybe that was just in the rush of it all. Since then I had moved to a different city, and honestly I had to stop listening to true crime podcasts entirely. The irony isn't lost on me though. I spent years learning about how predators operate, but I still fell for one of the oldest tricks in the book. The scariest part knowing that he's still out there, targeting other fans, using our fascination with danger to put us in real danger. I often get emails from different accounts claiming to have information about various cases. I delete them immediately now. I've learned the price that comes with seeking information. Sometimes you end up becoming part of the story yourself. The second story comes from Michael, a 31-year-old teacher from Oregon, who hosts his own small true crime podcast. I started my podcast, Forgotten Crimes, about 2 years ago. It's not huge, but I'm passionate about bringing attention to cold cases that other shows haven't covered. I do a lot of research, contact family members when possible, and sometimes even visit locations where crimes occurred. Last spring, I did a 3-part series on a case from 1994 involving serial killer Robert Hayes, who murdered 5 people in rural Oregon before disappearing. The police believe he's dead, but his body was never found, and the case remains technically unsolved. About a month after those episodes aired, I started getting messages from a listener who said they had new information about Hayes. The person claimed to be the son of Hayes' victims, and he had evidence that Hayes was still alive. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Portland. The guy who showed up introduced himself as David. He seemed normal enough, mid-30s, well-dressed and articulate. He said his mother had been Hayes' 4th victim, and that he was searching for answers his whole life. David had documents that looked legit, police reports, autopsy records, and even witness statements. But more importantly, he had what appeared to be recent photographs of a man who claimed was Robert Hayes, now in his 70s, living under a false identity in Washington state. I was skeptical, but the photos were compelling. The man in them had the same distinctive scar on his left hand that Hayes had, according to the police records. David convinced me to drive to Washington with him to confront this man. He said if we could get a confession on tape, we could finally give the families closure and get Hayes arrested. I should have called the police instead, but I was thinking like a podcaster, not like someone who'd heard hundreds of stories about people making exactly this kind of mistake. We drove to a small town called Millbrook, about 2 hours north of Portland. David directed me to an isolated house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by tall pine trees. He said Hayes was living there, under the name William Crawford. As soon as we pulled into the driveway, I felt uneasy. The house looked abandoned. Some windows were boarded up, and there was no car in the driveway. I asked David if he was sure this was the right place. He said Crawford was probably just running errands, and that we should wait. But instead of staying in the car, David got out and started walking toward the house. He called back to me, "Come on, I want to show you something." Against my better judgment, I followed him. He led me around to the back of the house, where there was a small shed. David opened the door and gestured for me to look inside. The shed was set up like a shrine to Robert Hayes. The walls covered in newspaper clippings about the murders, police photos of the crime scenes, and pictures of the victims. But what made my stomach drop was that there were dozens of screenshots from my podcast website, printouts of my episode transcripts, and photos of me that I'd never seen before. I turned to run, but David was blocking the doorway. He wasn't David, and his mother hadn't been one of Hayes' victims. He was Robert Hayes. Hayes had been listening to my podcast and become obsessed with how I was telling his story. He said I'd gotten several details wrong, and he wanted to set the record straight before he died. It was very clear that he hadn't brought me there just to talk. He'd been planning this for 4 weeks. The shed contained rope, duct tape, and tools that I don't want to describe in detail. Hayes told me he wanted to create one final episode, but this time he would be the host, and I would be the subject. He went on to explain that he never stopped killing after 1994. He'd just gotten better at hiding the bodies and avoiding detection. He'd been following true crime podcasts and learning from other killers' mistakes. The only reason I'm alive to tell this story is because Hayes made one critical error. He was so focused on showing me a shrine, he hadn't noticed my phone was still recording. I had started recording when we first got to the house, thinking I might get some good ambient shots for a future episode. While Hayes was explaining his plans for me, my phone had been automatically uploading the recording to my cloud storage, where it was being transcribed in real time and sent to my podcast partner as part of our normal workflow. My partner Lisa was monitoring the transcripts from her home office in Portland when she saw our conversation taking place. She called 911 and sent them my location. The police arrived just as Hayes was starting to tie me up. He's now serving multiple life sentences for the original murders, plus 3 additional victims they connected to him after his arrest. But here's the part that still gets me. During his interrogation, Hayes told police that I wasn't his first target. He had been systematically targeting podcasters who covered his case, planning to kill them one by one until someone told the story correctly. He had already been stalking the other podcasters. If he hadn't been caught in my incident, I'm sure they would have been next. The police found details filed on dozens of true crime podcasters and other YouTubers he'd been studying. He knew where they lived and where they worked. I still do the podcast, but I completely changed how I approached it. I never meet listeners in person anymore. I use a PO box instead of my home address, and I'm a lot more careful about what personal info I share on the show. The scariest part is realizing that when you spend your time telling stories about killers, sometimes the killers are listening back. The final story comes from Lisa, a 26-year-old marketing coordinator from Florida who attends true crime fan conventions. I'm part of a pretty tight-knit community of true crime fans who attend conventions, meetups, and live podcast recordings around the country. It's like a Comic-Con, but for people obsessed with murder cases. I know that sounds insane and morbid to a lot of people, but there's something comforting about being around others who share your fascination with the darker aspects of human nature. Last November, I attended a crime con in Tampa, which is one of the biggest true crime conventions in the county. There are panels with retired detectives, authors, podcast hosts, and even some survivors of violent crimes. It's pretty educational, and it's incredibly well organised. On the second day of the convention, I was attending a panel about cold cases when I noticed a man in the audience who seemed to be taking an unusual amount of interest in me. He was probably in his 40s, average height, wearing a baseball cap. Every time I looked in his direction, he was staring at me. During the lunch break, he approached me in the convention centre lobby. He introduced himself as Gary and said he noticed my serial killing trading cards t-shirt and wanted to compliment my taste in true crime merchandise. We started talking about our favourite cases and podcasts. Gary seemed knowledgeable and passionate about true crime, though he had some unusual opinions about certain killers that made me slightly uncomfortable. He talked about Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer with what seemed like admiration rather than the academic fascination that most true crime fans have. But he was friendly and seemed harmless, so when he suggested we grab coffee after the convention, I agreed. We went to a Starbucks near the centre, and our conversation continued. Gary told me he was from Jacksonville, which is about 2 hours north of Tampa, and he had attended true crime events all over Florida. He said he was working on writing a book about the psychology of evil, and asked if I'd be interested in being interviewed for it. I was flattered. Being featured in a true crime book seemed like a dream come true for someone like me. We exchanged contact information, and Gary said he'd send me some sample chapters from his book so I could get a feel for his writing style. The emails started arriving in the next week. Gary's book samples were incredibly detailed accounts of various murders, but were written from the killer's point of view, rather than an investigative or analytical standpoint. Even for me, the writing was disturbing, and seemed to focus more on the violence itself, rather than understanding the psychology behind it. I mentioned the tone seemed unusual for a psychology book. Gary said he was trying to create an immersive experience that would help readers truly understand how killers think. Red flags should have been going off, but I was so excited about potentially being published in a book that I overlooked my concerns. Gary started asking me to meet him for more interviews at various places in Florida. He said he wanted to conduct our conversation at places where famous crimes had occurred because it would help put me in the right mindset. The first location he suggested was the Gainesville apartment complex, where Danny Rowling, the Gainesville Ripper, had murdered college students in the 90s. Gary said he wanted to interview me there because he was writing a chapter about Rowling and thought the location would provide authentic atmosphere. I agreed to meet him there on a Saturday afternoon. The apartment complex still exists, though it looks different now than it did in the 90s, of course. Gary was waiting for me in the parking lot when I arrived. He led me to the specific building where the first victims had lived. Gary had done his research. He knew exactly which apartments were involved and could describe the crime scenes in disturbing detail. What made me increasingly uncomfortable was how excited Gary seemed to be. He wasn't talking about the case from investigative perspective or showing empathy. He was describing Rowland's methods with what sounded like enthusiasm. When I suggested we move to a coffee shop to continue, Gary insisted that we stay. He said he wanted to show me something that would help me understand the killer's mindset. Gary pulled out his phone and showed me crime scene photographs that I'd never seen before. They were extremely graphic and appeared to be from the actual police investigation. When I asked him where he got them, he said he had sources in law enforcement. I started to realise that Gary probably wasn't writing a book. I told him I needed to leave, but he became agitated. He said we were just getting to the interesting part of the interview and that I couldn't leave until we were finished. I started walking to my car, but Gary followed me. He kept talking about how the Gainesville Ripper had chosen his victims, describing their routines and vulnerabilities in detail that went far beyond what had been reported in the media. When I reached my car, Gary put his hand on the door to prevent me from opening it. He said I reminded him of Rowland's victims, young, blonde, living alone, and trusting of strangers. I realised that Gary knew details about my personal life that I didn't share with him. He knew where I lived, where I worked. I managed to get into my car and drive away, but Gary followed me for almost 20 minutes before finally turning off. I drove directly to the nearest police station. The officers took my report seriously, especially when I showed them the crime scene photos Gary had shared. Those photos had never been released to the public, which meant Gary had either obtained them illegally or had some connection to law enforcement that he was using inappropriately. But when they investigated, they discovered that this Gary didn't exist. The name was fake, the phone number attached to a burner phone, and the email address created with false information. However, the investigation led to a disturbing discovery. Police found that someone matching Gary's description had been approaching young women at crime events across multiple states, always with the same story about writing a book, suggesting meetings. Each other woman came forward with similar experiences. In each case, Gary had tried to isolate them at crime scenes and demonstrated knowledge about cases that suggested he had access to confidential information. But when the police found and analysed the crime scene photos that Gary had shown, they weren't from the Gainesville Ripper case at all. They were from recent, unsolved murders. The FBI took over the investigation at this point, and I was told not to discuss the case publicly while it was ongoing. They believed Gary had been responsible for multiple murders and have been using the true crime fan communities to study and investigate techniques. He's still out there, but the FBI has his photo now. But he's proven to be very good at avoiding detection. I still attend true crime events, but I'm a lot more cautious now. I never meet strangers alone. I don't share personal information, and I trust my instincts when someone feels off. The scariest part is knowing that true crime fans are full of people who are genuinely passionate about justice and understanding criminal behaviour. But they're also hunting grounds for predators who understand that the fascination with danger makes us just as vulnerable to manipulation. When you spend your time thinking about how killers operate, it's easy to forget that they might be thinking about you too. These stories show how fascination with true crime can sometimes put us in real danger. The very communities we turn to for education and entertainment can become hunting grounds for kind of predators that we study. If you're a true crime fan, remember to protect your personal information and never meet strangers alone. Trust your instincts. Thanks for watching, and remember, these stories are just stories.